Yes.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Rabbi. Hello, everyone.
Hello, hello. Okay, let's get started. There was a journalist who once heard about a Jew who would pray at the Western Wall every single day. And he was fascinated by this concept that a Jew would come every single day to Jerusalem to pray at the Kotel. So the journalist really wanted to interview this person and goes over to this. After they finish praying, the journalist goes over to the person and says, I understand that you pray every day at the wall. How long have you been doing this? And the man says, I've been doing this for 60 years. Wow, 60 years, that's amazing. What do you pray for? He says, I pray for peace. I pray for brotherhood. I pray that we should all be unified in friendship. Our children should grow up in the spirit of love. And the journalist says, after doing this for 60 years, how do you feel? How do you feel about it? He says, I feel like I'm praying to a wall. Not a very good joke. I know.
Rabbi,
yeah.
can I tell you, my non-so-religious family members tell me this joke about every 4 months.
Yeah.
And it really hurts my feelings.
Okay,
Maybe coming from you, it's a little bit different, but yeah, I just wanted to point it out.
Okay, so it's a bad joke, I know. But the topic that we're going to talk about is a controversial topic. So I thought maybe starting off with a bad joke might be a good way to start a controversial discussion.
I'm sorry, I can't help it.
Okay, so anyways, I apologize if you are offended by that, but really,
hysterical.
really, the topic that we're going to discuss today is the sanctity of Jerusalem and what a special place our holy city is. So let me just bring this up on the screen so you have the readings. Okay. So a little bit of modern history. In June of 1967, Israel was attacked by 3 nations simultaneously: Egypt in the south, Syria in the north, and Jordan in the center. And miraculously, after 6 days of fighting, Israel was victorious. And they, in the south, Israel captured the Sinai Desert, and the north, the Golan Heights, and in the center, a large part of territory, including East Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. Now, 19 years earlier, in the War of Independence, East Jerusalem was lost to Jordan. And so for the first time in 19 years, Jews had access to the Kotel, to the Western Wall. And really, for the first time in 1900 years, the entire city was united under Jewish control. And this was an immense moment. Many of you remember that. And Israel annexed East Jerusalem and declared Jerusalem as the undivided, eternal capital of the Jewish people. So this first quote that we have here is a news report on 28th June 1967. The Israeli government announced that the official reunification of Jerusalem would take place on the following morning. Some people feared that too swift an opening of the 19-year-old barriers would lead to tensions and violence. But the Minister of Defense, Moshe Dayan, was emphatic that there should be no hesitation, no delays. The mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek, said, dawn came and we did it. We removed the fences, dismantled the checkpoints, and started blowing up the dividing walls. Jerusalem was once again a physical unity, a single city. Now, of course, Jews around the world were ecstatic at this news, at this development. But, of course, international critique, political pressure came soon after. And we know that the UN Security Council passed a resolution declaring this change of status illegal. And sadly, Jerusalem has become the site of many terror attacks. And although, unfortunately, Israel has given into some of the pressure and returned some of the conquered territory, Israel has never considered returning the Temple Mount and the Western Wall. So, given the fact that this is a city that has a history of tension, you might say, perhaps it's a good idea to return the Western Wall. Everybody will be happy. The United Nations will be very, very excited if we gave it back. And maybe it'll bring peace to the Middle East. Who knows? My question is, why do you think people feel so strongly about this particular real estate in the middle of Israel? Why is it such a hotly contested place where, of course, we as Jews consider it the most sacred site on earth? But not everybody feels that way. Others feel that it shouldn't belong to the Jews. So why do you think there's something unique about Jerusalem? Any thoughts?
Well, it says in the Torah that that's the place that the God will choose.
Okay, very good. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look at the verses in the Torah that describe God's choice of Jerusalem. Any other thoughts?
Rabbi, I just wanted to say as an aside, one of the things that's always disturbed me about this, about the the attacks on Israel, when on November 29th, 1947, which happened to have been my 4th birthday, the UN partitioned Israel, as we know, and Jerusalem was supposed to be an international city. Now, nobody, Jordan attacked, they all attacked and everything. And Jordan, took control and everything and just desecrated graves and so on, and used some of the gravestones as walkways and so on and so forth. And nobody cared that Jordan violated this thing was that Jerusalem was supposed to be an international city. Nobody said anything. It was just, accepted. And all of a sudden, when Israel took control over it, ever since then, everybody has been, being high dudgeon. As we know, there's, as you've said, high terror attacks. And I think it goes back to anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish sentiment that,
Okay, Rachel, thank you for sharing that. We're gonna dive into the texts and the sources now that describe the uniqueness of the city. We know that long before Jews set foot in Jerusalem, they established temples in several places outside of Jerusalem and even outside of Israel. Jerusalem was the last place to house our temple, but it was not the first place. So I want to just give a brief overview of the locations that housed the temple or housed the tabernacle, the Mishkan, before King Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem. So Maimonides in his Mishnah Torah describes how it evolved. He says Torah already specified that the tabernacle, the Mishkan, that Moses built was temporary. As soon as they entered Israel, they built the Mishkan in a place called Gilgal for 14 years. That was those were the years that they conquered and divided the land among the tribes. From there, it came to a place called Shiloh, where they built a stone house without a roof. That stood for 369 years. When Eli, the high priest, passed away, Shiloh was destroyed. The Jews then came to Nov and built a temple there. When the prophet Samuel passed away, this too was destroyed, and they came to Givon. From Givon, they came to the eternal home in Jerusalem. Combined, the temple was in Givon and Nov for 57 years. So we know that the Mishkan was first built in the desert, right? The year was 1312 BCE. It did not have a permanent location because the Jews wandered for 40 years. So wherever they went, the Mishkan went with them. And once they come into the land of Israel, this traveling Mishkan was relocated, and over a certain period of time, as we just read, for many years, it was for 57 years, it was in Nov and Givon, in private homes. And eventually, once King David captured Jerusalem, a temporary site was erected where the temple was built. And later on, in his son's time, in King Solomon's time, first temple was built. Later on, the second temple stood in the very same spot. And we believe that when Mashiach comes, the third temple will be rebuilt in that very same spot on the Temple Mount. And that will be a permanent temple, never to be destroyed. Now, there's something unique about Jerusalem and Shiloh, which other locations did not have. And that was exclusivity. What does it mean to be exclusive? It means that as long as there was a temple in Jerusalem or Shiloh, you are not allowed to bring any offerings in other places. The only exclusive place where offerings were allowed were Shiloh and Jerusalem. And so the Torah describes both of them as having exclusive status. Have a look here. The Torah says, you must eat the tithings of your crops, wine and oil, as well as the firstborn of your cattle and sheep before God, your God, in the location of his choosing. As was mentioned before, so we said that the even though the Torah doesn't specify which location this is, but the Midrash gives us insight and tells us that the location of God's choosing is referring to both Shiloh and Jerusalem. Until Shiloh, God did not specify a location. Once Shiloh was destroyed, it was again temporary until the next place of God's choosing, which was Jerusalem. So now the question becomes, if we're saying that there are two places that God chose, Shiloh and Jerusalem, why don't we find that Shiloh resonates with Jews around the world as much as Jerusalem does? If I were to ask you, what's the holy cities in the world, Shiloh doesn't usually come up. And it's not nearly as well known or as sacred as Jerusalem. If we're saying that the whole reason that Jerusalem is holy and special because God singled it out as the center of worship and sanctity, Shiloh could have been chosen just as well as Jerusalem. Shiloh came even before Jerusalem. So why can't we, if it was good enough then, why can't we say, okay, we'll build you don't want to give us Jerusalem? No problem, we'll go back to Shiloh. Shiloh has history of being a location that God chose for the temple. But no, we all know that Jerusalem is the single place that is considered to be our holy city. Once Jerusalem was chosen, there was no going back. But the history of Jerusalem actually predates the temple. Let's have a look at some of the events that happened even before that. Abraham fought a war to release his nephew Lot from captivity. The Torah describes the war and tells us that afterwards, the son of Noah, whose name was Shem, who was then the king of Shalem, invited Abraham to sit down for a dinner. Where is Shalem? Shalem is Jerusalem. Why was it called Shalem? Shalem in Hebrew means perfect. So it was known as a place of perfection. Now, we're going to look here at a 13th century scholar named Ramban, Nachmanides, who says, Shalem is Jerusalem, as the psalmist wrote, his tabernacle was in Shalem. From time immemorial, the nations knew that this was the preeminent location situated at the center of the inhabited world. It is possible that they were also aware of the cosmic significance of this location. It's located directly under the celestial sanctuary where God's presence is manifest. So everybody knew back then how special this particular city was. Abraham knew about it. Noah knew about it. And even Adam, the very first human being, knew about it. How did Adam know about Jerusalem? The answer is, that is exactly where he was created. Adam, the first human being, where the Torah says that God formed him out of the clay and breathed life into his nostrils. Where did that clay come from? We're taught that it came from the Temple Mount, from the location where he would later build an altar. The first time that Adam was created, the sixth day of creation, he opens up his eyes, and what does he see? He sees Jerusalem. And that is why, for so many centuries and millennia, this became the spot. This became the spot where so many significant things in our history happened. Back to the Rambam, the Mishnah Torah, where he says in his laws of the temple, there is a widely held tradition that the location where Kings David and Solomon erected the altar, the threshing floor, is where Abraham erected the altar upon which he bound Isaac. The story of the Akedah, where Isaac, the ultimate story of the test of faith, where Abraham is about to sacrifice his son Isaac. Where did it happen? Right there, Temple Mount. Going back 10 generations earlier, this is where Noah built his altar after emerging from the ark. This is where Cain and Abel built their altars. Adam built an altar there and brought an offering to God when he was created. And like we said, Adam himself was created at the very spot that he received atonement. So of course, it's most appropriate that the king of such a special city was Shem, the son of Noah. Shem, at the time, was the most prominent person alive. And so it was fitting that the holiest location of earth was his territory. So many important things happened in this very spot. And the Torah refers to it as the spot that God will choose. What makes it so holy? Why is it such a special spot? So before we answer that, just one last thing that happened there, Jacob's dream. Remember the story where he dreams and he sees a ladder with angels going up and down? Where did that happen? You guessed it. The Temple Mount. So one of the things that the Torah tells us about Jacob's dream is that he calls it the house of God, the gate to heaven. A gateway is an intersection that links two places. Jacob has a vision, has a dream of angels going up and down through this gateway. And our sages understood this as teaching that the angels are carrying our prayers up to God from that very spot. At the very same time, the angels that are descending are carrying God's responses to us. Have a look at this midrash. This teaches us that anyone who prays in Jerusalem is considered to have prayed before the throne of God's glory. For the gateway to heaven is in Jerusalem. The gates are wide open in this place for our prayers to be heard. As the passage states, this is the gate to heaven. A 13th century commentary, Rabbeinu Bachya, talks about the blessings of God descending to this place. He says God's primary providence is over this land. God certainly pays attention to all countries, but his primary concern and providence is over this land. From this land, his blessings extend to the rest of the world. It's like a heart that is positioned at the center of the body because it's the source of life, and it distributes its life for us to all the limbs. And of course, while it talks about the whole land of Israel, it's primarily in Jerusalem, where it's the gateway for our prayers to ascend to heaven at God's responses in the form of blessings to come down to earth. It is considered the epitome, the peak of holiness and spirituality. And it's almost like you go there and you feel that God is whispering in your ear. you can feel a sense of holiness and sanctity in this place. The Midrash says, as the navel is positioned at the center of the human body, so is Israel at the center of the universe. Israel is the center of the universe. Jerusalem is the center of Israel. The temple is the center of Jerusalem. The sanctuary is the center of the temple, and the holy ark is the center of the sanctuary. So, of course, wherever we are in the world, we pray the Amidah facing Jerusalem. We always pray to this spot because it's the center of the universe. What does it mean that Jerusalem is characterized as the navel, the nexus of heaven and earth? The navel is not factually at the center of the body, but it's the nexus between the higher and lower parts of the body. Jerusalem is considered the nexus of spirituality and materialism. So that if we think about the epicenter of the universe, for us, it's Jerusalem. There were other places that housed the temple, but it doesn't say about all those other places that it's the nexus between heaven and earth. Why wasn't Shiloh the nexus between heaven and earth? If in fact it was one of the places that God chose and selected at his special place. As we said before, it was once there was an exclusivity factor in Shiloh had that only Jerusalem shared. There were both places chosen by God to be exclusive places of worship, and yet there's a distinction between them. And here we get to a little textual analysis to understand this teaching. There's two verses that sound very, very similar. I want you to pay attention here to the verse here on the screen, where Deuteronomy 12 says, "Do not bring offerings in any place you choose to God, only in the place that God will choose from among all your tribal regions to set his name. There you will seek his presence. There you may bring your burnt offerings and sacrifices." Okay, you got it? Now, a few passages later, verse 11, the Torah says something very similar. "Bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings and sacrifices, to the place where God, your God, will choose to establish his name. Beware lest you bring your burnt offerings to any place you choose." Sounds exactly the same, right? The Torah doesn't actually name the two places that it's talking about. Our sages had a tradition that the first reading was about Shiloh, and the second reading is about Jerusalem. And there's a significant difference between them. I'm going to go back to the first reading, which is Shiloh. Here is the Shiloh reading. If you notice here, the Torah first talks about outside altars, right? Don't bring offerings anywhere else. And then informs us that God will select a location for our offerings, which we know is Shiloh. With respect to Jerusalem, it's just the opposite. Let's bring up the Jerusalem text, 7b. Here, the Torah does it in the reverse. First, it informs us that God will select a location for our offerings, and only then does it say, beware lest you bring your burnt offerings to any place you choose, to any other place. Very subtle distinction, but an important one. because it tells us the difference between Shiloh and Jerusalem. Once the Jews were settled in the land of Israel, they needed a central location to bring their offerings. And so Shiloh was chosen. It wasn't necessarily chosen because it was going to be God's home here on earth. It was chosen because we needed a central location in our land to bring offerings. And that's why in the Torah, it first says, you're not allowed to bring your offerings anywhere else. We understand there's a need for a central location, which prompts the selection of Shiloh as that central location. It's a dedicated location where all offerings will be brought. When it comes to Jerusalem, it's different. It's not that we happen to need a central location, so God chose Jerusalem as being his choice. It's that God chose it to be his place, and therefore you are not allowed to bring it anywhere else. In other words, what we're saying is Shiloh was chosen for logistical reasons. We needed a place to set down our altar. We found a place called Shiloh. Jerusalem was chosen to be God's home. Shiloh, you could say, another way of putting it is that Shiloh was chosen for the sake of the Jews, and Jerusalem was chosen for God. It's not, in other words, from the beginning of time, this was a place that God chose, and that's why the moment that Adam was created, he sensed the holiness of the place. Why? It was holy because God chose to make this his home. So Shiloh was chosen as a place for offerings temporarily, but God's home was always Jerusalem. And that's why Shiloh is not a suitable substitute for being our eternal capital. Shiloh does not capture the sanctity of the city of Jerusalem. It served a good purpose in its time, but it never was God's chosen home. And therefore, when the temple was destroyed, the sanctity of Shiloh expired. When it comes to Jerusalem, the holiness of Jerusalem as God's home is independent of the temple. Even now, after the temple was destroyed, the Temple Mount remains the holiest site on earth. And we see this in the book of Chronicles, where God says to King Solomon, after he completed the building of the first temple, God says, I chose and consecrated this house so that my name will be there forever, and my eyes and heart will focus there at all times. So Shiloh was never destined to be a place of eternal sanctity and holiness. Shiloh has a great history, and therefore it remains a historic site. It's nice to visit a place where our ancestors once worshipped. But Jerusalem is not about history. Jerusalem's uniqueness is current. It's today. It's not a relic of the past. Jerusalem continues to have a presence of the Shekhinah, of the divine presence, till this very day. In fact, according to Jewish law, we are not in the current state, we are not allowed to walk on the Har HaBayit, on the Temple Mount, because we are considered to be in a state of Tumah, in a state of ritual impurity, until Mashiach comes. And the Temple Mount is a sacred place which only a person who is tahor is allowed to walk. And this is why Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, is the one, the only, and the eternal center of the Jewish people. It is the place where God's presence rests until today. It is the place where the future temple, the third temple, will be built when Mashiach comes. There will not be another site chosen, because once Jerusalem was chosen as the center for God's home to be built, that becomes the eternal place for the Shekhinah, for God's presence. Any questions so far?
No questions.
No questions? It's clear?
Rabbi, doesn't the last part of Jerusalem doesn't that also mean peace?
Shalem means perfect, but it also is related to the word shalom, from peace. Yes.
Okay, I thought so. Thank you.
Now we have a question. So we obviously know about the importance of Jerusalem as our holy city, being so central to God as his chosen place. Question is, if that's the case, why did God not choose to establish the temple there in the first place? Why did it have to go around to different places, to Shiloh? It could have gone directly to Jerusalem. So it sounds like a waste that we spent like 4.5 centuries in other locations before coming to God's chosen place. It wasn't like God changed his mind and chose Jerusalem later. We know that Jerusalem was chosen by God from the very beginning. So why do we have to have this series of other places and other locations before landing in the place that God really chose? So the simple answer is that we wanted to, but we couldn't. When Joshua first brought the Jewish people into the land, he wanted to conquer Jerusalem. And the tribe whose region Jerusalem fell into was the tribe of Judah. But the tribe of Judah was unable to dislodge the Jebusites. They were the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Now, this seems surprising, because if God was doing miracles and allowing us to conquer the land of Israel, couldn't God just do another miracle and allow them to conquer Jerusalem? The whole thing was miraculous, right? Remember the whole thing of conquering 7 nations? People feared that they were too mighty and they would never be able to conquer. And Moses says, don't worry, God is doing this for you. Just have a little faith. And so why are we saying that all of a sudden when it came to Jerusalem, they would have loved to conquer Jerusalem, but they just couldn't? So Rashi tells us that this has nothing to do with their military weakness. Obviously, the Jebusites weren't stronger than God. There was a side problem. as Rashi says, they were able, but they were not permitted. Why? Because of the oath that Abraham had sworn to Avimelech, king of the Philistines. Abraham had made a peace treaty with Avimelech, and they agreed to terms for a permanent peace among them. Avimelech pledged never to harass Abraham and his people. Abraham pledged that when his descendants, it was known that Abraham's descendants were going to settle in the land of Israel, which was then known as the land of Canaan. Abraham pledged not to dislodge Avimelech's descendants from their domain, but that pledge had an expiration date. Have a look at this verse in Genesis. Now swear by God that you will not lie to me, my children and my grandchildren. Treat me with kindness that I showed you concerning the land in which you sojourn. So Avimelech allows Abraham to live in his country, even though he was an outsider, he was not a Philistine. In turn, Avimelech demands the same courtesy from Abraham. Avimelech knew that God was going to grant his land to Abraham's descendants, and he knew that his grandchildren were going to be at the mercy of the Jewish people. So he asked Abraham to pledge that they would allow, just like he's letting Abraham live in his land, Abraham would allow his children to live in their land. And so some of Avimelech's children moved to Jerusalem, and they became known as the Jebusites. How many generations did Abraham make this pledge for? 3 generations. Like it says here, my children, and my grandchildren. At the time that the Jews conquered the land of Israel, some of Avimelech's grandchildren were still alive. So therefore, they had to establish their temple in other places rather than Jerusalem. Once the last grandchild of Avimelech passes away, the pledge of Abraham expired. This was in the days of King David. And King David was therefore free to conquer Jerusalem. Now, there was a mountainous fortress. David conquers it, but he doesn't stop there. Even after King David conquers Jerusalem, he doesn't build a temple right away. First of all, he did not want to take possession of the right of the city by conquest alone. And he didn't want to bring peace offerings on a land that was acquired through conquest. So what does he do? He negotiates with the owner of the Temple Mount to sell the mountain to him. As the book of Samuel says, Aravna asked, why did my master, the king, come to my home? David replied, I came to purchase your threshing floor for the purpose of erecting an altar for God upon it. And David purchased the threshing floor and the cattle, and David erected an altar there and placed burnt offerings and peace offerings upon it. Even though David had conquered the Temple Mount, he made sure to also purchase it for legal tender. He feared that if the Jewish people's only reason for building the temple was because they gained this territory through conquest, another nation could easily come up and conquer it from them. And David knew that this was God's chosen home. He wanted it to be the eternal capital of the Jewish people. He wanted it to be clear that this land was acquired not just by conquest, but also through the consent of the previous owner. David was willing to pay any money, whatever it took. So that even if in the future the Temple Mount would be conquered, it would not erase our Jewish rights to this space. King David wanted the Temple Mount and Jerusalem as a city to be the eternal capital of the Jewish people. And this is the reason why the Jews did not establish a temple there when they first arrived, even though they knew how central and important it was from the very beginning. Now, the reason we just gave is a little disappointing. It sounds like for hundreds of years, the Jews had to wait to enter Jerusalem because of a technical issue, because Abraham made a deal with Avimelech. And so the Jews lost out on possession of the very gateway to heaven because Abraham made this pledge and Avimelech's grandchildren happened to live very long lives. There must be something more. There must be something deeper, because Abraham would not have pledged something so significant. It's kind of like, did Abraham not know that what he was giving up here? That he was depriving his descendants of Jerusalem for such a long time? So the answer comes from the Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud. We're told that everything happens in the right time. It wasn't simply a technical reason why the Jews were barred from Jerusalem until the times of King David. It was that they were not worthy of having the city of Jerusalem until that time. Their spiritual state was not conducive to own this, to take possession of the sanctity of Jerusalem until the times of King David. So in order for us to be hosts to the Shekhinah, to be the hosts for the divine presence, we have to be in a state of unity. When the Jewish people are fragmented, we're not able to be appropriate hosts for the divine presence. Jerusalem is known as a city of unity. As the Talmud says here, Rabbi Yeshua, the son of Levi, said, Jerusalem built up is like a city joined together. In Hebrew, Ke'ir shechubra la yachdav. It's a city that binds the Jewish people to each other. So yes, you might say that technically speaking, because the land was divided amongst the 12 tribes, that the region of Jerusalem landed in the tribe of Judah. But at the same time, it also belonged equally to the entire nation. And of course, before God, we're all equal. No one is better than the other. So Jerusalem is the place where God's presence is felt, is palpable. And that's because it represents a place of unity and equality, a perfect place to house the one God. And until the time of King David, this was not the reality. There was a loose network of tribes, and sometimes we were more united, but most of the time we were pretty much divided and fragmented. It was King David who's credited with bringing these tribes together into a single cohesive kingdom. And that is when they were finally able to be worthy and deserving to access the soul of Jerusalem. So it wasn't just a logistical, historical matter that kept the Jews from Jerusalem for so many years. Rather, the Jewish nation had to evolve as a people. We had to come under a single banner as a nation that was united, and that took time. It wasn't until the times of King David that we were able to be deserving of this, and that's what we're saying here. So it's obvious now why Jerusalem is like no other place in the world, and why not even Shiloh, which is also called a place that God chose, is not considered God's home like Jerusalem is. It's not considered the gateway to heaven, the birthplace of humanity, the cradle of Jewish history. That is exclusively Jerusalem. And we called it the nexus of heaven and earth, the permanent home of God. And that is why Jerusalem is the only place that can serve as the eternal capital of the Jewish people. And it's not just our place because God promised it to us. And it's not just our place because we conquered it, we captured it in the times of Joshua. As we said, King David wanted to make sure that no claims could come in the future. It was rightfully and legally purchased as a permanent possession of the Jewish people so that nobody can take it away from us. It was the United Nations can't come along and make a resolution saying that it doesn't belong to the Jews. No matter what happens, this is our home. And Jerusalem was, is, and always will remain the eternal, undivided capital of the Jewish people. However, the way we view this, and we are grateful that we have the opportunity today to visit this sacred city, and acknowledging all of the sanctity that is present in this place, that did not go away just because the temple was destroyed, and that the blessings to the entire world come from Jerusalem, and are then spread to the rest of the world. So the attitude that we have is one of humble gratitude to God. It's not that we are arrogant about this, that we own Jerusalem, nobody else has a claim to it. We recognize this truth, and we are overwhelmed by the magnitude of this gift that God has given us. And therefore, the way we view Jerusalem is with a sense of reverence. The word in Hebrew, Yerushalayim, is made up of two words. Yira means reverence, and Shalem means perfect. So it's the place of perfection. Together, it's the perfect place of reverence for God. Jerusalem inspires perfect reverence for God. And therefore, when we are in a place chosen by God to be his home, his eternal home, and we're kind of visiting the king's palace, right? It becomes much more of a responsibility. We have to take responsibility for our behavior, and we act appropriately. And if that's true, wherever we live, then how much more so in a God's home and in God's throne room, so to speak. The Temple Mount is is like the throne, the place where God resides. So when we go there, we feel a sense of awe and reverence, and we are humbled by the gift and the opportunity that God gives us to spend time in his presence. Any thoughts on Jerusalem? How many people here have been to Jerusalem?
I have not yet.
Not yet. Okay. It's good. It's good you're saying not yet.
Not yet. Yeah,
Every Jew aspires to visit Jerusalem.
absolutely.
Not
So,
yet.
God willing, very soon we'll all be there, because when Mashiach comes, all Jews will return to our homeland and to our holy city in Jerusalem. Yeah, it's a very, very special place. Those who visit today can get a preview of what it will be like for all of us in the future, God willing, very, very soon. So thank you for joining. Have a
Thank you, Rabbi.
wonderful week.
Thanks. Same to you.
All the best.